Martha Wren pressed one trembling dollar into the auctioneer's hand, while every man in that barn laughed at her. They saw a foolish old widow buying a worthless, dying blind horse. Martha saw something else entirely. Burned into that broken mare's shoulder was a brand she hadn't seen in 40 years, her father's brand. The man who vanished into the Montana mountains and never came home. If you've ever been told you're too old, too tired, or too broken to matter, this story is for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer auction at Caldwell Flats was the kind of event that brought out the worst in men, not because they were evil necessarily, but because heat did something to people out here in Montana Territory in the summer of 1883, when the grass burned gold and the creek beds ran thin and the air itself smelled like dust and old leather and too many bodies packed too close together. Heat made men careless. It made them loud. It made them cruel in the comfortable way that men are cruel when no one important is watching. Martha Wren arrived alone the way she did everything. She tied her old gray gelding to the post at the far end of the fence line, away from the clusters of ranchers and cowboys who filled the auction yard with noise and tobacco smoke, and the kind of easy laughter that had never once in her life been directed at her kindly. She pulled her hat down low, tucked her hands into the pockets of her worn cotton dress, and walked toward the crowd without speaking to anyone. Nobody greeted her. That was fine. Martha had stopped expecting greetings a long time ago. At 62, she had buried a husband, outlived two neighbors who were supposed to outlive her, and watched the small parcel of land her father left her shrink year by year as drought and debt nibbled at the edges. She had thick, calloused hands, a face weathered past the point of beauty into something harder and more honest, and eyes the color of Winter Creek water, gray flat and still. People in Caldwell Flats called her quiet. What they meant was that she made them uncomfortable in the way that women who had stopped needing anything from anyone always made people uncomfortable. She was not there for company. She was there because she needed a pack animal. Something cheap. Something sturdy enough to carry supplies up the mountain trail to her cabin, and old enough that nobody else would want it. She had $4 to her name, 3 of which needed to go toward feed, and she intended to spend no more than 1. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Dobbins, with a voice like a brass bell, was working through the early lots with practiced efficiency. Good horses went first. Quarter horses and mustangs, young and strong, going for $30, $40, sometimes $60, to the ranchers who could afford them. Martha watched without bidding. She had no business with good horses. Then Dobbins disappeared behind the barn gate for a moment, and when the gate swung open again, the laughter started before the animal even cleared the threshold. The mare was old. That was the first thing anyone could see. Her spine pushed up against her coat like a ridge of exposed stone. Her ribs showed through her dull, dusty hide with the clarity of something architectural, not flesh but framework, the skeleton of a horse wearing just enough skin to hold itself together. She moved with a stumbling, uncertain quality that made several of the men near Martha step back instinctively, as though being too close to that much suffering might be contagious. And her eyes were white. Fully, completely white, pale as river fog, with no pupil visible, no darkness, no depth. Blind. Completely and irreversibly blind. The old mare turned her head slowly from side to side as the crowd noise hit her, reading the world through sound and smell the way blind creatures do, her nostrils flaring, her ears rotating with careful, quiet attention. "Gentlemen!" Dobbins called out, his voice already laced with the particular amusement of a man presenting a joke. "We have here one gray mare approximately 18 to 20 years of age, sound of body." He paused to let the laughter roll through before finishing, in every respect except, her eyesight, and her weight, and her general condition. More laughter. A man near the front, big red-handed fellow in a canvas jacket called out, "Dobbins, you trying to sell us a corpse? She ain't dead yet, Harlow. Give her an hour. Starting bid is $5. The laughter that followed that number was genuine and unkind. $5 for that. A rancher near Martha shook his head and spat into the dirt. Two younger cowboys made a show of checking their pockets in mock consideration before dissolving into grins. A woman near the water trough, wife of one of the cattle buyers, overdressed for the occasion in a way that suggested she didn't come from here. Originally covered her mouth and looked away from the mare with an expression of delicate distaste. Nobody raised a hand. Dobbins waited. $4 then. Come on, somebody give her a dignified end. 3. Somebody. Silence except for the flies and the distant sound of cattle somewhere behind the main yard. Martha's eyes had stopped moving. She was staring at the mare's left shoulder. The coat was thick with dust and matted in places with old dried mud, but the brand was still visible beneath it, the way things burned deep enough always remain visible if you know what you're looking for. A circle perhaps 3 inches across, split clean through the center by one straight vertical line. Martha's breath stopped. Her hands buried in her pockets closed into fists. She knew that brand. She had grown up with that brand. She had watched her father press it into wood, scratch it into the margins of his letters, draw it for her in the dirt when she was small enough to sit on his knee and ask him why horses needed marks. So they know where they belong, he'd told her. So no matter how far they travel, the truth of who they are follows them home. Samuel Wren's brand. Her father's brand. Samuel Wren, who had been one of the finest horse breeders in 3 counties. Samuel Wren, who had ridden into the Bitterroot Mountains in the spring of 1843 to investigate something he wouldn't fully explain to her mother and had never come home. Samuel Wren, who had been declared lost, then dead, then forgotten, the way men without money or powerful friends are always eventually forgotten. Martha Wren raised her hand. $1, she said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how it was steady. Inside her chest, something was happening that she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten it was possible. Not hope exactly, but the first crack in a wall that had been standing for 40 years. The laughter that followed was the loudest of the afternoon. $1, Dobbins repeated, and his voice carried enough theatrical disbelief that half the crowd turned to look at Martha. We have $1 from Mrs. Wren. Is that you back there? It is, Martha said. Ma'am, I respect your generosity, but this animal is going to cost more to feed than she'll ever. $1, Martha said again. Flat. Final. The canvas jacket man, Harlow, turned around and found Martha with his eyes. He was grinning. Lord almighty, Martha Wren. You taking in strays now. Thought you barely had enough to keep your own self fed. I didn't ask for your opinion, Harlow. Well, I'm giving it for free, which is about what that horse is worth. Sold, Dobbins said, cutting through the noise with the authority of a man who recognized an ended auction when he heard one. $1 to Mrs. Wren. Someone bring the lady her purchase. She walked forward through the crowd. Men stepped aside, not out of respect, but the way people step aside from something they find awkward, something that makes the laughter curdle slightly at the edges. She walked past Harlow without looking at him, past the overdressed woman who murmured something to her husband that Martha didn't catch and didn't need to, past 2 young cowboys who had gone quieter now, the joke having shifted into something they couldn't quite name. The hired hand who brought the mare forward had the decency to look uncomfortable. Martha took the lead rope from his hands. The old blind mare turned her head toward Martha immediately, toward her smell, her heat, the particular weight of her presence, and Martha stood very still while the animal's nose moved across her forearm, her shoulder the side of her face, reading her, deciding. Then the mare exhaled, a long, slow breath. Martha put her hand against the side of the animal's neck, right below the jaw, the way her father had taught her when she was small. Don't reach for the face first. Let them feel you're not afraid. Let them decide you're safe. All right, she said quietly, too low for anyone around her to hear. All right, I've got you now. She walked the mare to the fence post where her gelding was tied. Behind her, the auction moved on. The laughter faded into other business. The summer heat pressed down on Caldwell Flats with the indifferent weight of a season that didn't care what happened to old women or dying horses or 40-year-old questions. Martha didn't look back. She cleaned the brand that night by lantern light behind the lean-to at the back of her cabin where the roof still held and the ground stayed dry. She used a wet cloth and worked slowly, carefully, the way you work when you're afraid of what you might uncover, and equally afraid of stopping. The brand was real. She'd known it was real the moment she saw it at the auction, but knowing and seeing clearly are different things, and she needed to see it clearly. She needed there to be no question. She held the lantern close enough that the heat touched her wrist. The circle. The straight line through the center. Her father's mark. "Where did you come from?" she said aloud. The mare she was already thinking of her as Ash, though she hadn't said the name out loud yet, because naming a thing made it real, and real things could be taken from you. Ash turned her white eyes toward Martha's voice and made a low sound in her throat. Martha set the lantern on the fence post and pressed both palms flat against the mare's shoulder, against the brand, and stood there for a long moment in the hot Montana night, with the crickets loud in the grass and the stars hard and bright above the mountains. Her father had been missing for 40 years. Every horse her father ever bred carried this brand. Every one of them. He was meticulous about it, almost religious about it. These were his horses, and this mark was his signature, the proof that whatever happened to these animals, whatever distance they covered, or hands they passed through, the truth of their origin couldn't be erased. Which meant this horse had at some point in her life belonged to Samuel Wren. Which meant Samuel Wren had been somewhere. Which meant there was a trail. Martha pulled her hands back. She breathed. She told herself to be slow, to be careful, to be the kind of methodical woman she'd trained herself to be over 62 years of hard living. Then she went inside and pulled out her mother's trunk from beneath the bed. She hadn't opened the trunk in 11 years. Not since her mother died. Not since the last reason to go looking through the past had presented itself, and she'd pushed it down and closed the lid and told herself the past was done and buried and better left that way. The trunk smelled like cedar and old paper and something faintly sweet that she'd never been able to identify. Her mother's soap, maybe, or something the wood itself gave off over decades of holding closed everything that hurt too much to display. She lifted the lid. On top, her parents' marriage certificate. Beneath that, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, the envelopes yellowed to the color of old teeth. Her mother's handwriting. Her father's. And then deeper, a folded newspaper. The paper so fragile, it nearly fell apart when she touched it. Caldwell Flats Courier, May 17th, 1843. Local horse breeder. Samuel Wren reported missing search parties dispatched into Bitterroot Range. Martha had read this article so many times in her younger years that she'd memorized it without intending to. She set it aside. She kept digging. Near the bottom of the trunk, beneath a folded quilt that had been her grandmother's, she found something she had never seen before. A map, hand-drawn on a piece of oilcloth, the lines faded but still legible. Mountain trails, creek markers, elevation marks done in her father's cramped, precise handwriting. She recognized his hand immediately, the way he formed his sevens, the way his capital letters leaned slightly right, like they were walking into a wind. She turned the oilcloth over. On the back, in pencil and handwriting that was hurried, rushed in a way she had never seen her father's hand rush before, were 11 words. "If I do not come home, start at Split Rock Creek." Martha sat on the floor of her cabin for a long time. The trunk was open in front of her. The lantern burned on the table. Outside, Ash moved quietly in the lean-to, and her old gelding shifted his weight, and the summer night pressed warm against the cabin walls. Start at Split Rock Creek. She knew that creek. She knew exactly where it was. High up in the Bitterroots, a full day's hard ride into the mountains, territory she hadn't traveled since she was a young woman, territory that had been quietly and effectively controlled for the better part of 30 years by Silas Crowder and his cattle operation. Silas Crowder. The name moved through her like a cold current in warm water. She'd known that name all her life. In Caldwell Flats, Crowder was not a man you discussed openly unless you were saying something admiring. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He controlled the water rights on the main grazing trails. He had the sheriff, a meek, slope-shouldered man named Briggs, in his pocket so completely that most people had simply stopped pretending otherwise. When Crowder wanted something, Caldwell Flats found a way to provide it. When Crowder wanted silence, Caldwell Flats went quiet. Crowder had been the last man seen arguing with her father before Samuel Wren disappeared. Martha had known that for 40 years, too. She'd never had any proof of anything more than an argument. Neither had anyone else. Or if they had, they'd been wise enough to keep it to themselves. She looked at the map again. Then she looked at the oilcloth. Then she sat with the weight of this, the extraordinary, impossible, terrifying weight of it, and made herself breathe slowly and think clearly. In the morning, she told herself, "In the morning, I'll think about what to do." But she didn't sleep. She was at the auction clerk's office when it opened at 7 in the morning, before the heat got serious, before the main street of Caldwell Flats filled up with the day's commerce. The clerk, a young man named Petrie, with ink-stained fingers, and the kind of pale indoor complexion that suggested he'd never worked outside a day in his life, looked up from his ledger with the mild surprise of someone unaccustomed to customers at this hour. "Mrs. Wren," he said carefully, the tone that meant you are unexpected and somewhat alarming. "The blind mare," Martha said. "The one I purchased yesterday. I need to know where she came from. Who brought her in?" Petrie blinked. "That information is—" "I paid for that animal," Martha said. "That makes her my property. Knowing the provenance of my property seems like a reasonable thing to want." A pause. Petrie clearly weighed the effort of arguing against Martha Wren's particular brand of immovable calm, and decided it wasn't worth it. He opened the auction ledger, ran his finger down a column of entries, and stopped. The mare came in as part of a lot from Crowder Ranch. Liquidated stock animals they had no more use for. Brought in by Crowder's foreman, fellow named Tate. He looked up. "That's all it says." "When?" "3 days ago." Martha absorbed this. "How long do you think that mare has been on Crowder land?" Petrie shrugged. "I wouldn't know, ma'am. She came in with 6 other animals, all old, all in poor condition. Crowder's men do a clear-out every few years, apparently. Bring in whatever isn't earning its keep." "Thank you," Martha said. She turned to leave. "Mrs. Wren," Petrie said. She stopped but didn't turn. "That horse isn't worth the trouble, whatever you're thinking. Crowder's men came in asking about her yesterday afternoon after you'd already gone. Said there'd been a mistake, that the mare wasn't supposed to be included in the lot." He paused. "I told them she'd been legally purchased, and there was nothing to be done about it." Martha turned then. "Crowder's men came asking about her," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. By name." "Did they describe the animal or ask by some specific marking?" Something shifted in Petrie's expression, the look of a man who'd just realized he might have been present at the beginning of something significant. They asked specifically about the branded gray mare. Said the brand on her shoulder was a registered mark they needed to account for." Martha held his gaze for one long moment. "Thank you, Petrie," she said. "You've been very helpful." But she rode home fast. Not in fear, or not only in fear, but in the particular focused urgency of a woman who has just had her suspicion confirmed. They knew the brand. Crowder's men knew the brand, knew it enough to come back looking for the animal that carried it the very day after it sold, which meant Crowder knew what that brand was, which meant Crowder had known for however long he'd had that old mare exactly who had once owned her. She was saddling Ash when she heard boots on the dry ground behind her. She turned without flinching. The man standing at the edge of her property was tall and lean, in the way that men who spend years at elevation tend to get, like weather had compressed everything unnecessary out of him and left only what was essential. He was perhaps 38, with dark skin burned deep by Montana sun, and a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who expected it to hold under pressure. He wore no hat in the morning heat. A rifle rested across his forearm, pointed at nothing in particular, which was its own kind of statement. He was watching her with an expression that was not hostile, but was not comfortable either. The expression of a man deciding something. "You're the woman who bought Crowder's blind horse," he said. "She's my horse now," Martha said. "You got business here, or are you just going to stand in my yard and state facts?" The corner of his mouth moved, barely. "Name's Caleb Rusk. I run a small spread up past Harmon Ridge. Used to scout for the territory marshal before that got complicated." What made it complicated? "Crowder," he said simply. Martha studied him. "You came out here to tell me something." "I came out here to see if you were stupid or brave," he said. "Those are the only two kinds of people who go looking for trouble with Silas Crowder in my experience." "And what's your verdict?" He looked at her for a long moment, at her weathered face, her straight spine, the map tucked into the breast pocket of her dress, where she'd put it this morning, without entirely meaning to, as if her hands had known before her mind caught up that she was going to need it today. "I reckon both," he said. "Then we understand each other," Martha said, and turned back to finishing the saddle. He didn't leave. "Mrs. Wren?" His voice was quieter now. Not softer quieter, which was different. "Those trails up into the Bitterroots have been Crowder's territory for 30 years. His men don't just patrol them. They own them in every way that matters out here, where the law is 3 days right away. You ride up into those mountains alone, and Crowder gets wind of it." He stopped, started again. "There are people who went up there and didn't come back." Martha paused her work. "I know," she said quietly. Silence. "That brand on the mare's shoulder," Caleb said. It wasn't quite a question. Martha turned to look at him fully. She owed him nothing. She didn't know him. He could be one of Crowder's men for all she knew, though her gut told her otherwise, and her gut had kept her alive for 62 years in country that tried to kill people regularly. "My father's brand," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. "Samuel Wren," he said. "You know the name." "I know the name," he said carefully. "My father's ranch was 4 miles from here when I was a boy. The story of what happened to Samuel Wren was—" He stopped. The old ranchers used to get quiet when his name came up, the kind of quiet that means everyone knows something nobody's willing to say. Martha's hands had gone still against the saddle leather. "My father left a map," she said. "He left instructions. He told my mother that if he didn't come home, someone should start at Split Rock Creek." She watched Caleb's face. "I'm starting at Split Rock Creek." He was quiet for a long stretch. A hawk turned in slow circles above the cabin. The summer heat built around them like something physical pressing in from all sides. "I'll follow you up," Caleb said finally. "Not with you. Behind you. If you get into trouble, I can manage my own trouble." "I expect you can," he said. "I'm not offering because I think you can't. I'm offering because Crowder's men ride in pairs, and you can't be in 2 places at once." He shifted the rifle on his forearm. "Besides, if Samuel Wren's brand ended up on a horse in Crowder's herd, that means Crowder had your father's horses at some point. That means there's a thread worth pulling." Martha looked at him for a long assessing moment. "You lost something to Crowder," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Stay out of my way," she said, "and try to keep up." She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Ash's back. The old blind mare stood steady beneath her ears, moving, reading the sounds of the summer morning with that careful, unhurried attention that Martha was already beginning to recognize. She touched her heels gently to the mare's sides. Ash moved forward. Behind her, she heard Caleb Rusk move toward his own horse without another word. Ahead of them, the mountains rose blue and gold in the summer heat, ancient and indifferent, and full of everything that had been buried for 40 years, waiting in the dark for someone brave enough or foolish enough or angry enough to finally come looking. Martha Wren rode toward them with her father's map in her pocket and her father's brand on the horse beneath her, and she did not look back. The trail into the Bitterroots didn't forgive anyone. It didn't matter how old you were or how righteous your reason for climbing. The mountain took what it wanted from you and left the rest. Martha had been riding for 3 hours before she allowed herself to stop and drink from her canteen. Ash moved beneath her with the careful, methodical attention of an animal that had learned to trust something other than its eyes. She used her ears, her nose the pressure of Martha's knees, and the slight shifts of weight that telegraphed the terrain ahead. Martha had never ridden a blind horse before. She'd expected it to be frightening. Instead, it felt like a conversation. Every signal she gave Ash answered. Every hesitation the mare showed Martha listened to. They were in their own strange way exactly what the other needed. She didn't look back for Caleb Rusk. She could hear him occasionally, the distant ring of a shod hoof on stone. A sound that was there and then wasn't present enough to confirm he hadn't turned back, distant enough to confirm he was keeping his word about staying out of her way. She didn't know what to make of him yet. She'd spent enough years around men to recognize the difference between the ones who helped because they expected something in return, and the ones who helped because they'd been broken by the same thing that was breaking you. Caleb Rusk had the eyes of the second kind. Quiet damage. The kind a man carried when the loss was old enough that he'd stopped flinching at it but hadn't stopped feeling it. That was fine. She understood old damage. The trail narrowed as the altitude climbed the morning heat, thickening around her even as the air thinned. Ash's breathing stayed steady. Martha kept one hand loose on the reins and the other resting on her thigh close to the pistol she'd loaded before leaving the cabin, an old Colt single-action that had been her husband's well-maintained and accurate, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. Hope was one thing. Preparation was another. She was perhaps 4 miles above the valley floor when Ash stopped. Not stumbled, not hesitated. Stopped completely with the sudden deliberateness of an animal whose senses had caught something Martha's hadn't. The mare's ears were straight up and rotating slowly forward. Her nostrils were wide. She made no sound, but every muscle in her body went to a particular kind of still that Martha recognized as attention rather than fear. Martha went still too. She listened. For a long moment, nothing. Wind. The distant sound of something moving through dry grass, probably deer. Then, farther up the trail, the sound she'd been half expecting since she left the valley voices. 2 of them. Male. Low and unhurried the way men sound when they believe they're alone. Martha backed Ash slowly off the trail and into the trees without making a sound. The mare trusted her completely now, stepping backward with careful precision, and Martha felt something move through her chest that might in another context have been gratitude. She sat in the shadows and listened. The riders came around the upper bend at a walk. 2 men in Crowder's colors, the dusty brown canvas that his ranch hands all wore, both of them armed, both of them scanning the trail with the practiced attentiveness of men who'd been told to look for something specific. One of them was talking. Said she bought it right there at the auction, $1, took it straight home. Old widow woman, blind horse, nobody thought nothing of it. Tate thought something of it, the other one said. He was on Dobbins's doorstep before supper. Brand's registered to a dead man. Shouldn't matter anymore. Crowder thinks it matters, the first man said. That's enough for me. They passed within 30 feet of where Martha sat unmoving in the shadow of the trees. Ash didn't make a sound, didn't shift, didn't even flick an ear. Martha kept one hand flat on the mare's neck, steady pressure, and thought about what she'd just heard. Brand's registered to a dead man. Crowder knew her father was dead. Not missing, not lost, dead. The word landed in Martha's chest, like a stone dropped into still water, and she felt the ripples of it move outward through everything she'd carried for 40 years. She had always known on some level that lived below hope and above certainty. You didn't lose a man like her father to a mountain trail. Samuel Wren had been too careful, too experienced, too familiar with that country to simply vanish by accident. She had always known, but knowing it in your bones was different from having a stranger confirm it while riding past you on a summer trail, casual and untroubled, like he was discussing weather. She waited until the sound of the hooves faded completely. Then she waited 5 more minutes, counting her breath. Then she urged Ash back onto the trail and kept climbing. Behind her, she heard Caleb Rusk move out of his own cover. She still didn't look back, but she picked up the pace. It was past noon when she found the first piece of her father. Not his body. Not yet. Something smaller, but in its own way just as definitive. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if Ash hadn't stopped again, not with the alarm of before, but with a softer, more curious hesitation, the mare's nose dropping toward the side of the trail where a section of old fence line had collapsed into the brush, the weathered posts nearly invisible beneath years of overgrowth and dead grass. Martha dismounted carefully, keeping a hand on Ash's flank, and pushed the grass back with her boot. The rusted horseshoes were tangled in the dead roots, 3 of them old enough to have sunk partially into the earth, the iron gone orange and fragile with age. She crouched down and looked at them without touching. Then she looked at the fence post closest to her, the one that had fallen at a different angle than the others, as if it had been hit by something rather than simply rotted through. Tacked to the underside of that post, where no weather could reach it, was a strip of leather tack. Bridle piece. Old but preserved by the dryness and the protection of the post above it. She turned it over. Scratched into the back of the leather, barely visible but unmistakably intentional, were 2 letters. S.W. Samuel Wren. Martha stood up slowly, the leather strip in her hand. Her father had put this here. He had been on this trail at some point, probably before he sent word to her mother, before he rode up toward Split Rock Creek, before whatever happened to him happened. He had been here, and he had left a mark the way he always left marks, the way he'd spent his life, ensuring that the truth of where things came from could always be traced back. So no matter how far they travel, the truth follows them home. She put the leather piece into her pocket alongside the map. "He was here," she said aloud to no one, or to Ash, who was as good an audience as any. The sound of boots on rock came from behind her, and this time she turned. Caleb Rusk came around the bend on his horse, a big dun quarter horse, that moved with the ease of an animal used to mountain travel. He pulled up when he saw Martha crouch beside the fallen fence line, and something in his expression shifted. "You found something," he said. "My father's initials." She held up the leather piece. "He marked this tack before he went up." Caleb dismounted and came to look, not reaching for the leather, just examining it where she held it. "How sure are you it's his?" "As sure as I am of anything," Martha said. "He did this on every piece of tack he made, said a man should stand behind his work with his name." She tucked it back into her pocket. "You find something behind me." He was quiet for a beat too long. "What?" she said. "Campfire ring," he said. "About half a mile back off the east side of the trail. Old, very old stones, stacked in a way I haven't seen used in a long time. But someone's been there recently. Within the last week, I'd say. Footprints around the outside. More than one person." Martha looked at him steadily. Crowder's men watching the trail, maybe, or watching a specific location. He met her eyes. "Someone knows something was left up here, Martha. Someone's been looking." She noticed he'd used her first name. She noticed she didn't mind. "Then we find it before they do," she said simply, and turned back to Ash. The afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch east when they reached the creek. Martha heard Split Rock Creek before she saw it, the particular sound of mountain water moving over stone in the dry season way, less a rush than a conversation, persistent and low. Ash lifted her head at the sound and moved toward it with more energy than she'd shown all day, some old instinct pulling her forward. The creek came through a narrow cut between 2 granite outcroppings, the water running clear and cold despite the summer heat, and on the far side of it, set back from the bank in the shadow of a stand of old pines, were the ruins of a camp. Not a casual traveler's camp. A working camp, the kind a man sets up when he expects to be somewhere for several days. The remains of a fire pit much older than the one Caleb had found below. A rusted metal stake driven into the ground with a chainring attached for tying horses. And near the base of the largest pine, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated pine needles and dead leaves, the outline of something buried. Martha stood at the edge of the camp and felt the hair on her arms rise. "He was here," she said. Different from before. Not discovery, now confirmation. "The creek matches the name on the map," Caleb asked from behind her. "Split Rock." She pointed upstream to where the creek bed was interrupted by a granite formation that split the water exactly in 2, sending equal streams around each side before they rejoined below. He drew that, That exact shape. He was standing right here when he drew it. She went to the pine and began clearing away the needle debris with her hands, working methodically, not fast. Caleb crouched beside her without being asked and helped neither of them speaking. The sound of the creak filled the silence between them. She felt the edge of metal before she saw it. A box. Iron, not tin heavier. More serious, the kind of box a man uses when he needs to keep something safe from weather and time and determined interference. The lock had corroded, but the box itself was intact, the quality of the ironwork speaking to something crafted to last. Martha sat back on her heels and looked at it. "That's it," she said. "Open it," Caleb said quietly. "I know," she said. But she didn't move immediately. She sat with her hands on the box and let herself feel for just one moment the full weight of what this was. 40 years. Her mother's grief. Her own long silence. The way she'd learned to live around the absence of her father. The way you learn to walk around a missing floorboard. Careful, automatic, never quite forgetting it was there. She breathed in, breathed out. She opened the box. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth, the same material as the map her mother had saved, which told Martha her father had prepared carefully and deliberately, knowing what he was doing had to survive whether he did or not. She unwrapped the first layer. Land deeds. A stack of them, a dozen or more. The paper brittle but legible county territory. Records, official survey documents, the kind of paperwork that established ownership of grazing land and water rights in the territory. She looked at the names listed on them, and her jaw tightened. Every deed listed Silas Crowder as the rightful owner. But the original recorded owner on each document had been altered, the corrections obvious to anyone who looked closely, the ink a slightly different shade, the pressure of the second writing different from the first. These were forgeries, or rather, they were genuine documents that had been falsified after the fact, the original names written over with Crowder's. "He forged the land deeds," Martha said, hearing her own voice come out flat and strange. "All of them." Caleb leaned closer. "All of them." She set the deeds aside and unwrapped the second layer of oilcloth. Ledger pages, folded, numbered, covered in neat columns of figures and names. She scanned them and felt her stomach drop slowly like a stone falling through deep water. Payment records. He paid men to drive families off their land. Cash payments, names, listed dates. He kept his own record of it. She looked up at Caleb. He kept a record. "Arrogance," Caleb said. His voice had gone very quiet. He never thought anyone would find it. Never thought he had to be careful, because nobody was ever going to look. "My father was going to look," Martha said. She reached into the box one last time and found the last piece of oilcloth, smaller than the others, folded in tight on itself. She opened it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. It was a letter, written in her father's hand. Not the rushed handwriting of the message on the map. This was deliberate. Careful, the writing of a man who understood that this might be the last thing he ever wrote and wanted every word to count. June 3, 1843. Split Rock Creek, Bitterroot Range. I have gathered sufficient evidence to bring charges against Silas Crowder for land fraud, water rights theft, and the forced removal of no fewer than 11 families from their legal property. The documentation is complete and witnessed by myself. I intend to carry it to the territorial marshal at first opportunity. Crowder is aware that I have been gathering information. His man Tate came to my camp 2 nights ago and offered me money to stop. I refused. Tonight I expect he will send more than an offer. If this box reaches my daughter, Martha, tell her I did not run. Tell her I knew what I was doing, and I did it willingly because someone had to. Tell her the Wren name means something, and I intend to make sure it still means something after I am gone. I love her more than I have ever known how to say. That is a father's failing, and I own it. Samuel Wren. Martha read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest with both hands, and the summer afternoon moved around her, the creek running, the pines moving in the slight high country breeze. Ash somewhere behind her, breathing steadily, and she did not cry. But something inside her, that had been clenched since 1843, slowly finally let go. Caleb said nothing. He understood, she thought. The way people who have lost something permanently understand the moment when someone else gets confirmation of what they always suspected. She put the letter back in the box. Then she put the lid on the box. Then she stood up and said, "We need to move. Now." She didn't have to explain why. Caleb was already standing, already looking back up the trail toward the higher ground, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle, with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent a long time in places where trouble came fast and quiet. "How long do you think we have?" he asked. "Crowder's men were on the trail this morning," Martha said, moving to Ash and tying the strong box to the saddle with the leather cords she'd brought specifically for this purpose. She had known, or hoped, or both. "They'll have come back up when they didn't find me below, and someone's been watching the area near that campfire you found." She finished the knot and checked it twice. "Not long." "We could push straight down," Caleb said. "Fast descent, get to the valley before dark." "We could," Martha said. "But Crowder's men know this terrain better than either of us. If they've figured out where we've been, they'll set up below, on terrain they choose." She thought for a moment, running the mountain in her mind, the way her father had taught her to read land, not as a view, but as a system, the way water moved, the way trails connected, the way a man on higher ground always had an advantage over a man climbing toward him. "There's an eastern trail, comes down behind Harmon Ridge and meets the valley road a mile above town. It's longer, but they won't expect it." Caleb looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know this mountain." "My father used to bring me up here when I was young," she said. "Before everything." She turned to Mount Ash. "He said a person who knows the land can never truly be lost on it." She was halfway into the saddle when the first shot came, not close high and to the left above the creek cut from the direction of the granite outcroppings. A warning shot, or an attempt that missed, she couldn't tell which. What she could tell was that rock chips sprayed from the face of the nearest boulder, and Ash shied hard to the right, with a sound that was more shock than fear, and Martha held on by instinct and years, and nothing else. "Go!" Caleb shouted. She didn't need to be told. She kicked Ash into motion. Not reckless, not headlong, because you couldn't ride a blind horse headlong down a mountain without killing you both. But fast, purposefully. Fast, trusting the mare, the way the mare trusted her. The conversation between them, happening at speed now, knee pressure and weight shift, and the firm, steady contact of her hands telling Ash, "I know where we're going. Trust me. Move." And Ash moved. Behind her, she heard Caleb's rifle crack once. Not at anyone, necessarily, just the statement of it. The reminder that the pursuit wasn't going to be clean or free. She heard voices from above, 2 or 3 of them, the sharp, controlled sound of men who'd done this before. She pushed east. The eastern trail was narrower, and in worse repair than the main descent, which was exactly why she'd chosen it. Crowder's men might know it existed, but they wouldn't have positioned themselves on it, because nobody would expect a 62-year-old woman on a blind horse to take that path. That was the advantage of being consistently underestimated. Martha thought briefly, with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close enough to it. People forgot to account for you. She rode hard for 20 minutes, the strong box solid against the saddle beside her, Ash picking her way with extraordinary care and trust through terrain that would have tested a sighted animal and should have been impossible for a blind one. But the mare didn't falter. She took every cue Martha gave her, adjusted without panic, and kept moving with a steady, ground-eating rhythm that Martha would not have believed possible if she weren't sitting on top of it. Caleb came up behind her when the trail widened enough to permit it his dun horse breathing harder than Ash. He pulled alongside and they rode in parallel for a moment, both listening. The pursuit had fallen back. Not gone fallen back, regrouped, which meant they were repositioning, not retreating. "They'll have someone lower on the valley road," Caleb said, reading her mind. "I know. Harmon Ridge branches at the base. If they've got the north branch covered." "There's a creek ford," Martha said. south of the ridge base past the old Tilly property line. Not on any map Crowder would have. My father showed it to me." Caleb was quiet for half a second. "Your father left you a lot of tools." "He left me everything I needed," Martha said. "I just didn't know what I was going to need it for." She shifted Ash onto the southern branch before the trail visibly split, reading the terrain change the way her father had taught her, the subtle downslope to the right. The change in vegetation, where the ground held water longer, the way the pines thinned before the creek. Ash followed her without hesitation. They were halfway down the slope when Martha heard something that stopped her cold. Not riders, a voice. A single voicemail coming from the trees below and to her left, not shouting, not chasing, but speaking. Carefully. The tone of someone addressing another person directly. "Mrs. Wren." Clear. Deliberate. Loud enough to carry, not loud enough to echo. "I think you have something that belongs to me." Martha stopped Ash. Caleb pulled up beside her rifle already raised. From the tree line below, a rider emerged at a slow walk. Older, perhaps 70, though he carried his age the way powerful men often do, as if it were weight rather than weakness, something that pressed down on the world around him rather than on himself. His horse was magnificent, a deep chestnut that moved with the arrogant ease of an animal that had never known scarcity. His clothes were expensive in a way that was just past ostentatious, the kind of expensive that was so habitual it no longer needed to announce itself. Silas Crowder. Martha had seen him before in town over the years, had seen him from a distance. The way you see things you know are dangerous and keep yourself clear of. She had never been this close. She had never had reason to be. He was looking at the strong box tied to her saddle. "I'd like that returned," he said. His voice was calm, almost friendly. The voice of a man who had never had to raise it to be obeyed. "Whatever you think is in there, Mrs. Wren, I promise you it is considerably less interesting than the trouble it will bring you." "I know exactly what's in here," Martha said. Something in his expression moved, adjusted, recalibrated. He hadn't expected that. "Then you know it's old," he said. "Old paper, old grievances, old business that was settled long ago by people who are no longer alive to be bothered by it." "My father's not alive because of you," Martha said. The words came out clean and flat, no tremor, no heat. Just the truth, stated plainly in the summer air. A long pause. "Your father," Crowder said, "made a series of unfortunate decisions." "He decided to tell the truth," Martha said. "You decided to kill him for it. I decided to protect what I had built." His voice went slightly harder at the edges, just slightly, the first crack in the pleasantness. "Your father was going to unravel 30 years of work based on his personal opinion about what was fair. The law out here, Mrs. Wren, is not a fixed thing. It belongs to the people strong enough to shape it." "The law belongs to everyone," Martha said. He smiled at that, a real smile, which was somehow worse than a false one. "You believe that. I almost admire it." He reached into his coat. Not for a weapon, for an envelope. He held it up. $500, he said. "More money than you'll see in a lifetime on that broken-down patch of land you call a ranch. Give me the box and the map you found in your mother's trunk, and you will never see another difficult day in your life." Caleb's rifle remained perfectly steady. Martha looked at the envelope for exactly as long as it took to understand what it represented, and then she looked back at Crowder. "You came here yourself," she said. "You didn't just send your men. You came personally." She watched his face. "You're afraid." The smile stayed, but something behind it changed. "My father gathered enough evidence to take apart everything you built," Martha said. "And you know it. You've known it for 40 years, which is why you never fully relaxed about that box. Which is why your men came back to the auction clerk the same day I bought that mare. Which is why you're sitting on a horse in the middle of a mountain trail offering me money instead of just taking it." Her voice stayed even. "You need it to go away quietly. You can't afford for this to be loud." Crowder lowered the envelope slowly. The pleasantness was completely gone now. "I have 8 men on this mountain," he said quietly. "Your friend can fire that rifle once, maybe twice. After that, the arithmetic is not in your favor." "Maybe not," Martha said. "But that box will still be sitting in your territory when they find it, and your men will have to explain to a territorial marshal how a 62-year-old widow ended up dead next to 40-year-old evidence of land fraud." She held his gaze. "You're not the only one who understands arithmetic, Mr. Crowder." A sound came from above them on the trail riders, but not Crowder's men. The sound was different. More of them. Moving differently, with the particular organized quality of a group that had been coordinated rather than mobilized in reaction. Crowder heard it too. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't confidence. "The honest ranchers in this valley have been waiting a long time," Caleb said from beside Martha, his voice quiet and absolute. "Most of them lost something to you. I reached out to a few of them last night." A pause. Word travels fast when people have been waiting for a reason. 6 riders came over the ridge above. Then 8. Then more. Men who rode in the worn, practical way of people who worked land for a living. Not Crowder's men in their matching canvas, but individual ranchers, each of them carrying the specific set of their shoulders that comes from having been wronged, and having waited, and having finally been given a reason to stop waiting. Crowder looked at them, looked back at Martha. He was for perhaps the first time in 30 years alone on a mountain with fewer allies than the woman he'd come to silence. Martha untied the strongbox from the saddle and held it in both hands. Her father's life's work. His last act of courage. The thing he'd believed in enough to die for on a summer morning in 1843, in this same country, in this same heat, with the creek running the same clear, cold way it still ran 40 years later. "Silas Crowder," she said. "The reckoning's been a long time coming." His jaw tightened. His expensive horse shifted beneath him, reading the tension the way horses always did, more honest than the man who sat astride it. His eyes moved from Martha to Caleb to the ranchers gathering on the ridge and back, doing the arithmetic she'd accused him of finding it as unfavorable as she'd promised. One of the ranchers on the ridge called down an older man, gravel-voiced, who Martha recognized as Hector Pruitt, whose family had been run off their grazing land 12 years back. "We heard the shot, Mrs. Wren. Everything all right down there?" "Everything's fine, Mr. Pruitt," she called back. "Mr. Crowder was just leaving." Crowder looked at her one final time. The mask was completely down now, and what was underneath it was not the viciousness she might have expected from a man like him, but something worse. The blankness of someone who had spent so long being powerful that he had genuinely forgotten what accountability felt like. He was experiencing it for the first time in decades, and the experience was visibly foreign to him. He turned his horse and rode back into the trees without another word. Martha watched the space where he'd been for a moment. Then she looked down at the strongbox in her hands. Then up at the mountains above her, golden now in the long afternoon light, the bitterroots keeping their ancient silence indifferent as always, but she thought perhaps slightly less heavy. Caleb came up beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He'd learned, she thought, how to share space with grief without trying to fix it. "His men will regroup," he said finally. "We should move." "I know," she said. "The territorial marshal's office is 3 days' ride." "I know that too. Those ranchers up there," he tilted his head toward the ridge. "Most of them have been waiting for something to happen for a long time. They won't all go home tonight." Martha looked up at Hector Pruitt and the others on the ridge. Ordinary men, tired men, men who'd been afraid for a long time and were perhaps in this moment slightly less afraid. "No," she said. "They won't." She put the strongbox back against the saddle and secured it more firmly than before. Then she checked on Ash, running a hand along the mare's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the animal's breathing, the calm that the blind mare carried like a kind of wisdom, the equanimity of a creature that had learned to navigate an unseeing world one careful step at a time. "Good girl," she said quietly. "Almost home." She mounted. She looked up the trail toward the ridge and the gathered ranchers, then down toward the valley where Caldwell Flats waited the town that had laughed at her at the auction. The town that would have to find a way to reckon with what was inside this box. The town where her father's name had been quietly erased over 40 years of Crowder's careful management of memory and silence. "Let's go," she said to Caleb and to Ash and to Hector Pruitt and the rest of them, and to the summer evening and the mountains and whatever was coming next. She rode forward. The strong box held. The truth after 40 years underground, 40 years of darkness and silence, and the patient endurance of buried things, was finally moving toward the light. They rode into Caldwell Flats just before dark, 9 riders in a loose formation with Martha at the front and the strong box tied to her saddle, and the kind of silence around them that a town produces when it sees something coming that it doesn't know how to categorize. People stopped on the boardwalk. A woman pulling her child by the hand paused mid-step. 2 men outside the feed store watched without speaking. The barber came to his doorway and stayed there. Nobody called out. Nobody laughed. The laughter Martha noticed had gone completely out of the evening air, and what had replaced it was something older and more honest. The particular stillness of a community that senses without being told that something has shifted permanently. Sheriff Briggs was on the street. Martha had expected that. Crowder's men would have ridden ahead. Briggs would have been informed, positioned, instructed. He was standing in front of his office with his thumbs in his belt and an expression that was trying very hard to project authority and achieving something closer to cornered anxiety instead. He was a thin man. Briggs, thin in the physical way and thin in the moral way. The kind of man who had spent so long being someone else's instrument that he'd forgotten he had his own spine. "Mrs. Wren," he said as she pulled Ash to a stop in front of him, "I'm going to need you to come down off that horse and surrender whatever you took from Crowder property." The ranchers behind her didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of them was its own argument. "I didn't take anything from Crowder property," Martha said. "I retrieved something from public mountain land that was placed there by my father in 1843. She looked down at Briggs with the patient, unhurried certainty of a woman who has been right about something for 40 years and has finally stopped being required to pretend otherwise. "This box contains documented evidence of land fraud, forged deeds, and bribe records connected to Silas Crowder. I intend to hold it until a territorial marshal can receive it properly." Briggs's jaw worked. "Now, Martha." "Mrs. Wren," Caleb said from her left. His voice carried no particular heat, just the correction quiet and immovable. Briggs looked at Caleb, looked at the ranchers, looked back at Martha. She watched him do the arithmetic the same way Crowder had done it on the mountain and arrive at the same answer. "You can't just ride in here and—" "I already did," Martha said. She dismounted, keeping one hand on the strong box. "I'll be at my property tonight. If the territorial marshal isn't contacted by tomorrow morning, every man behind me will ride to the next county and contact him themselves." She looked at Briggs steadily. "And every one of them has a story about Crowder that your name is somewhere in the middle of." Briggs went pale in the lamplight spilling from his office window. Martha led Ash down the street to Hector Pruitt's stable. Hector had offered it without being asked. The way men offer things when they've finally decided which side of something they're on. And she didn't look back at Briggs. She didn't need to. She could hear him behind her deciding, and the sound of a man deciding to do nothing was one she recognized easily by now. Caleb fell in beside her. "That'll hold for tonight," he said. "Tonight is all I need," Martha said. She didn't sleep. She sat at Hector Pruitt's kitchen table with the strong box open in front of her and went through every document again, more carefully this time, with Hector's lamp burning close and Caleb sitting across from her with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking, and Hector himself standing near the door with his arms crossed and an expression of contained fury that had clearly been contained for 12 years and was finding the containment increasingly difficult. 3 of the forged deeds had Hector's family name on them. The original name visible beneath the alteration if you angled the paper toward the light just right. Hector looked at those documents for a long time without speaking. Then he set them down very carefully, as if they were something fragile, which they were not physically, but in the way that proof of injustice is always fragile, always in danger of being dismissed or discredited or buried again. 12 years, he said finally. 12 years I told my wife it wasn't her fault. Told her we'd done everything right. Told her the land just didn't work out. He stopped, started again. I believed Crowder when he showed me those papers. I believed them because I didn't know any better, and because I was scared, and because men like him count on men like me not knowing any better. You know better now, Martha said. What does that fix? More than you think, she said. Less than it should, but more than nothing. Hector picked up the documents again. Who else? Martha spread the ledger pages out on the table. 11 families named. I recognize most of the names. Kellermans, the widow Tansey, old Bert Hale before he moved his family east. People who left because they thought they had no choice. Caleb leaned forward and pointed to a column near the right margin of the ledger. These figures here, those are payment amounts. These names in the adjacent column. He stopped. Martha looked where he was pointing. The names in the adjacent column were men she knew, not Crowder's regular hands, local men. Farmers. One of them was a deacon at the church. One of them had 3 daughters in the Caldwell Flats schoolhouse right now. Men who had been paid in documented amounts to provide witness statements to look away to confirm stories that weren't true. He built a whole community around the lie, Martha said quietly. That's why nobody ever said anything. Not just fear. Complicity. The kitchen went very quiet. This goes to trial, Caleb said. All of it. It goes to trial? Martha agreed. Then someone knocked on Hector's door. Hector opened it with his hand near his holster, and the man on the other side was neither a threat nor anyone Martha had expected. He was perhaps 50, city-dressed in a way that was practical rather than ostentatious. Dark coat. No decorative, anything the kind of clothes a man wears when he moves through different environments and needs to be taken seriously in all of them. He carried a leather satchel and held his hat in his hand and had the particular expression of someone who has ridden hard and is choosing to present himself as calm anyway. My name is Thomas Aldridge, he said. I'm an attorney with the Territorial Land Commission out of Helena. I received a telegraph this morning from a source I'm not at liberty to name, indicating that evidence related to the Crowder land acquisitions might be surfacing tonight in Caldwell Flats. He looked at Martha. I rode 6 hours. I'd very much like to sit down. Martha studied him. Who sent the telegraph? She said. As I said. I heard what you said. I'm asking anyway. A pause. Something in his face shifted, not dishonesty adjusting, but privacy, considering whether it could afford to be shared. A clerk in Crowder's own operation, he said finally. Someone who has been documenting irregularities internally for the better part of 2 years and has been waiting for external evidence to align with what he knows. He contacted my office 6 months ago. We've been waiting. Martha looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the strongbox. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Inside witness, Caleb said carefully. Corroborating witness, Aldridge corrected. There's a significant difference legally. What he has confirms the pattern. What you... He looked at the strongbox. What you appear to have confirms the origin. Martha stood up and stepped back from the table. Sit down, Mr. Aldridge, she said. We have work to do. They worked through the night. Aldridge was methodical in the way that people trained to build legal cases are methodical, not cold, but precise. The emotion visible behind the precision rather than in spite of it. He went through each document in the box with the careful attention of a man who understood that every piece of this would eventually be scrutinized by people who were paid to find reasons to dismiss it. He made notes. He asked questions. He cross-referenced the ledger figures against dates and names with a focus that impressed even Martha, who was not easily impressed. At 2 a.m, he looked up from the ledger. This is enough, he said. This alone, without the corroborating witness, is enough to bring charges. With the witness, it becomes something that doesn't lose. What kind of charges? Hector asked from the corner where he'd been listening. Land fraud, falsification of public records, conspiracy to deprive citizens of legal property. Aldridge paused. And potentially with the letter from your father, Mrs. Wren, and the physical evidence at the campsite, a charge related to the events of 1843. The room went still in a very specific way. Say it plainly, Martha said. Aldridge met her eyes. Murder, or conspiracy to commit murder. It's 40 years old and the direct perpetrators may be dead. But Crowder ordered it, and the letter names him. The letter is my father's word, Martha said. He's not here to testify. No. Aldridge agreed. But the inside witness is, and he was told directly by Crowder himself what happened to Samuel Wren. He set down his pen. Crowder told him years ago, apparently in a moment of confidence, he now regrets. Old men sometimes talk about the things they've done when they believe the audience is safely controlled. Martha sat with that for a moment. Her father's death, described by the man who ordered it, preserved in the memory of a man who'd worked for that same killer. The strange, crooked path that truth sometimes had to travel to reach the light. Where is this witness now? She asked. Safe, Aldridge said, and frightened, and ready to talk, provided he believes this is moving forward rather than falling apart. It's moving forward, Martha said. She said it the way she said most things, without decoration, without performance. Just the fact of it placed in the room like a stone placed in the earth. Solid. Staying. Caleb looked at her across the table, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Not pity. Not even admiration exactly. Something quieter. The look of a person recognizing another person, fully seeing all of it. The grief and the fury and the 40 years, and the stubborn, indestructible refusal to stop, and finding it in its totality something worth witnessing. She looked away. There was still too much to do for that kind of attention. Bapatse. Just before dawn, the first thing went wrong. Hector's youngest son, a boy of 16 named Dell, who'd been sleeping in the barn loft, came through the back door at a run with the particular breathless quality of someone who'd been running since they saw something they needed to report immediately. Crowder's men, Dell said, pulling up short at the kitchen doorway. 7 of them. Coming in from the south road. Tate's with them. Aldridge looked up sharply. Tate? Crowder's foreman, Martha said. He's the one who brought Ash to the auction. If Tate's with them, Crowder knows about the telegraph, Aldridge said. He was already closing his satchel, organized and rapid. He knows I'm here. Does it matter? Caleb asked, already standing. It matters because Crowder will try to discredit this before it reaches Helena. If he can create a narrative in which this evidence was obtained illegally, in which I was here under irregular circumstances, he can muddy the water, Martha finished. He's very good at muddying water, Aldridge said. Martha looked at the strongbox, looked at the stack of documents organized now annotated in Aldridge's precise hand, looked at her father's letter sitting on top where she'd placed it. How much of this can you carry? She asked Aldridge. He patted the satchel. I've been copying key sections all night. The originals need to stay together, but I have enough. Take the letter, Martha said. She picked it up and held it out to him. Copy or original? That goes with you separate from everything else. If something happens to the box. Nothing's going to happen to the box, Caleb said. Caleb. She looked at him. Take the letter, Mr. Aldridge. Aldridge took it. Hector went to the window, looked, came back. They're at the south end of Main Street, moving slow, trying to look official. Briggs with them, Caleb asked. Can't tell from here. Martha closed the strongbox, locked it with the key she'd found inside it. Her father's key. She realized which meant he'd locked the box before hiding it, which meant he'd expected someone else to find it and wanted it protected even in retrieval. She pocketed the key. Dell, she said, and the boy straightened. Can you ride? Yes, ma'am. Hard and fast? Yes, ma'am. There's a ranch 4 miles north called the Kellerman property. The family's name is on those deeds, which means they have standing in this. You ride there now. You tell them Martha Wren needs witnesses at Hector Pruitt's stable before sunup. Can you do that? Dell was already moving. Yes, ma'am. He was gone before anyone could add anything to the instruction. Martha turned to Caleb. You and Hector go out the front, visible. Don't do anything aggressive, just be present. She looked at Hector. Your name is on those deeds. Crowder's men don't have legal authority to enter your property without Briggs, and even with Briggs it's questionable. Make them prove they have authority before they get through the door. Hector nodded once. Slow, certain. The nod of a man who has spent 12 years feeling powerless and has just remembered that the land under his feet is still legally his. And you? Caleb asked. I'm going to bring Ash out front, Martha said, where everyone can see her. She picked up the strongbox. Let them come. Let them explain in public what they want from a 62-year-old woman and a blind horse at dawn. The corner of Caleb's mouth moved. You're going to make this loud. I'm going to make this as loud as it needs to be, Martha said. That's what Crowder was afraid of from the start. He needed it quiet. He's always needed it quiet. She moved toward the door. He's not getting quiet anymore. She was standing in front of the stable with Ash beside her and the strongbox in her arms when Tate rode up. Tate was a big man, built like something assembled for a specific purpose, and not particularly concerned with whether the purpose was moral. He had a flat, weathered face and pale eyes that had learned to communicate nothing, and he sat his horse with the ease of a man who spent more time mounted than afoot. He looked at Martha, and at the strongbox, and at Ash, with the complex attention of a man who had been told to retrieve something, and was now calculating the obstacles. Behind him 6 riders, all Crowder's men, all armed. 2 doors down a lamp came on in an upstairs window, then another across the street. The commotion of horses at dawn had a way of bringing people to their windows, and people at windows had a way of becoming witnesses. Tate saw the lamps too. His jaw tightened slightly. Mrs. Wren, he said. Mr. Crowder would like his property returned. Tell me which property, Martha said. Be specific, in front of all these open windows. A pause. The box, he said. This box was found on public mountain land. It contains documents belonging to the territory of Montana and to the families whose land was stolen using those documents. Her voice carried clearly in the early morning air. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to shout. The stillness of the hour did the work for her. If Mr. Crowder has a legal claim to this box, he can make that claim before a territorial marshal. I'll be happy to hold it in safekeeping until then. Tate's horse shifted. He didn't let it. You're making a mistake, he said. I've been making mistakes for 62 years, Martha said. Buying this horse was the first good decision I've made in a while. I intend to keep making them. Ash stood beside her without moving. Blind eyes turned outward toward the street and the horses and the early morning sounds, reading everything through senses that had never needed light to function. She was very still, very calm. The calmness of an animal that had survived worse than this and had learned that survival was mostly about not wasting energy on panic. Martha found that calming too. She always had. Tate looked at the growing number of lit windows, looked at Caleb and Hector flanking Martha at a distance, looked at the strongbox in Martha's arms, did his arithmetic. This isn't over, he said. No, Martha agreed. It's just getting started. He pulled his horse around and rode back down the street. His men followed in a loose group that was trying to look purposeful and achieving something closer to retreat instead. Martha exhaled once, long and slow. They'll be back, Caleb said from behind her. I know. She turned toward the stable. Let's get Ash fed. It's going to be a long day. By mid-morning, everything changed. Del Pruitt came back, not with the Kellermans alone, but with 4 other families. The Tansey widow, gray-haired and straight-backed. Old Luther Hale's eldest son who'd come back from the east when he heard something was happening. 2 brothers named Cork, who'd been renting land they used to own. They arrived in wagons and on horseback. And they came quietly, the way people come when they've been waiting a long time and don't want to do anything that might cause this moment to dissolve before it becomes real. Aldridge organized them in Hector's barn. Martha listened from the doorway as he explained in clear and careful language what the document showed what the charges would be, what would be required of each family in terms of testimony. He was good at this, not warm exactly, but decent with the particular decency of someone who understood that legal processes were also human processes, that the people sitting in front of him had lost things that couldn't be fully documented in any court record. The widow Tansy raised her hand at one point. She was perhaps 70, small and precise, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of absorbing difficulty without being destroyed by it. "Will we get the land back?" she asked. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Some families may have legal recourse for compensation. The land itself in most cases will have changed hands multiple times since the original. "I'm not asking about most cases," Tansy said. "I'm asking about mine. Your situation is among the stronger claims in these documents," Aldridge said carefully. "I cannot promise outcomes. I can promise that your claim will be heard." She nodded once, sat back. The expression on her face was not hope, it was something more durable than hope. Something that had survived the absence of hope for a long time, and had learned to function without it. Martha recognized that expression because she'd worn it for 40 years. The door to the barn opened. The man who came in was not someone Martha recognized, which was unusual in a town this size. He was perhaps 45 thin, with the look of a man who had been losing weight recently from something other than physical activity. He was dressed in working clothes, but held himself differently from a working man. There was an indoor quality to his posture, a desk quality, despite the outfit. He stood at the entrance of the barn and looked at Aldridge with an expression of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake and is dealing with the aftermath of that recognition in real time. Aldridge stood up. "Everyone," he said, and his voice was careful and deliberate. "I'd like you to meet Owen Marsh. He is the inside witness I mentioned last night." The barn went completely silent. Owen Marsh looked at the assembled families. He looked at the strong box, which Martha had set on a hay bale near the center of the barn. He looked at Martha. "Mrs. Wren," he said. "I worked Crowder's land accounts for 11 years. I kept the real books." He swallowed. Not the ones he showed people. The real ones. Martha looked at him steadily. "Did you know what you were keeping records of?" He didn't flinch from the question, which told her something. "Not at first," he said. "By the time I understood what I was documenting, I was afraid. And I told myself it was history, that it was already done and nothing I did would change it." He stopped. "Crowder told me 3 years ago that Samuel Wren's death was necessary. Those were his exact words. He told me because he was establishing making sure I understood what happened to people who made themselves a problem." He looked at Martha, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had been carrying guilt long enough that it had changed his posture. "I'm sorry I waited this long." Martha looked at him for a long moment. "You're here now," she said. "Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever entirely. But the recognition that what he'd done today was real and mattered. That counts for something." Owen Marsh nodded, sat down, put his head in his hands briefly, then lifted it again. The decision had been made. The cost of it was already accruing, and he was paying it forward. Caleb appeared at Martha's shoulder. "Briggs just rode out," he said quietly. "South Road. Fast. Going to Crowder. Almost certainly." How long before Crowder moves, Caleb thought. He can't come in openly now. Too many people, too public. He'll try something else, something that puts the evidence in question. He paused. Or someone. Martha looked at the strongbox. "We need that marshal here faster than 3 days." "I know someone," Hector said from the side wall where he'd been listening. "Former deputy, runs a small operation 2 counties east. Owes me a significant favor." He met Martha's eyes. "Might be persuaded to contact the marshal's office on the telegraph line that doesn't run through Caldwell Flats." "Do it," Martha said. Hector left at a jog which Martha had not seen him do in years, and which told her that this morning had done something to him that regular days hadn't managed, given him back the specific energy of a man with a purpose. She turned back to the barn. Aldridge was organizing documents. Owen Marsh was talking in a low voice to the widow Tansy, who was listening with the careful attention of someone weighing each word for its truthfulness before accepting it. The Cork brothers were looking at the forged deeds with expressions that were moving between grief and fury, at a pace that suggested the two emotions had become inseparable. Caleb came around to stand beside Martha close enough that she could speak quietly. "Crowder's going to move tonight," she said. "He has to. Daylight keeps shrinking his options." "What do you think he does?" "He's spent 40 years managing what people know and what they're willing to say," Martha said. "That's been his only real tool from the beginning. Not violence exactly, but the credible threat of it, and fear. He's very good with fear." She watched Owen Marsh across the barn. "But he's never had to operate against this many people at once who aren't afraid anymore." "Afraid is relative," Caleb said. "These people are still afraid. They're just more afraid of going back to how things were." Martha looked at him. "That's surprisingly insightful." "I have my moments," he said. She almost smiled. Very almost. "When this is over," she said, carefully looking away from him. "Whatever over looks like that land your family lost to Crowder, is your name in those ledgers?" A beat of silence. "Cork family's not the only one," Caleb said quietly. "No," she said. "I didn't think it was." They stood side by side in Hector Pruitt's barn doorway, watching the morning activity of Caldwell Flats, a town in the process of remembering something it had been persuaded to forget, the way towns sometimes did when enough people in them stopped pretending at the same moment. It was a fragile thing. It could still collapse. Crowder still had money and connections, and the momentum of 4 decades of effective control. But momentum, Martha knew, could be reversed. It required only sufficient counterforce applied at precisely the right point. She picked up the strongbox. She carried it with her back into the barn. She set it on the hay bale in the center of the room, visible, solid, real, and looked around at every face in that space, at the widow Tansy and the Cork brothers and Owen Marsh and Aldridge and all the others. And she said clearly and without ceremony, "Nobody leaves tonight. We hold what we have and we hold it together. Crowder's last play is separating us. We don't give him that." She looked at each face in turn. "My father gathered this evidence alone in 1843 because there was nobody to stand with him. There are 20 of us in this room right now." She paused. He would have considered that an embarrassment of riches. Something shifted in the room. Not laughter exactly, but the release of tension that sometimes looks like laughter. The exhalation of people who have been holding something tight for a long time and have just been given permission to breathe. Caleb was watching her from the door. She didn't look at him. But she was aware of him, the way you're aware of something that has become, without announcement, a fixed point in the geography of your days. Outside, the summer afternoon pressed on. Heat and dust and the long golden Montana light that made everything look permanent, even when it wasn't. And somewhere south of Caldwell Flats, on his expensive horse, with his expensive fury and 40 years of built-up certainty that men like him were exempt from consequence, Silas Crowder was making his final calculation. Martha Wren was ready for whatever answer he arrived at. She had been ready. She understood now, since the moment she pressed one trembling dollar into an auctioneer's hand and looked at a dying blind mare, and recognized something that the whole laughing crowd had missed entirely. Truth, like a brand burned deep enough to survive anything. Even 40 years in the dark. The night came fast and hot, the way summer nights in Montana Territory did. When a storm was building somewhere distant, the air pressure changing, the insects going quieter, the horses in Hector's stable shifting, and restless in a way that had nothing to do with what was happening inside the barn, and everything to do with what the atmosphere was doing outside it. Martha felt it in her knees before she felt it anywhere else. She'd always been that way. Her body read weather before her mind caught up. She stood in the barn doorway, with her hand resting on Ash's neck, and felt the old mare reading it too, nostrils wide, ears moving in slow arcs that covered the full range of the night's sounds. "Storm coming," Martha said. "Not the only thing," Caleb said from behind her. He was right. She could hear it now, hoofbeats more than a few coming from the south road, at a pace that was not the controlled approach of men trying to look official. This was different. This was the sound of men who had stopped calculating and started moving. "How many?" she asked. Caleb listened. 8, maybe 10. She turned back into the barn. Aldridge, the documents. Aldridge was already moving, the years of professional urgency visible in how fast his hands worked without fumbling. He had the copied materials in his satchel. He looked at Martha. "The originals." "Stay with me," she said, picking up the strongbox. She looked around the barn. 20 people, give or take. Some of them frightened, the fear visible in the way they'd gone. Still, the particular stillness of people who had learned that being still was safer than moving when powerful men came for them. The widow Tansy had her hands folded in her lap and her chin up. Owen Marsh was pale, but hadn't moved from his spot on the hay bale. The Cork brothers had stood up simultaneously, the unconscious synchrony of siblings. Hector Pruitt came through the back door at a walk which told Martha the situation was serious enough that running hadn't seemed useful. "Briggs is with them," he said. "And Crowder." "Crowder himself," Martha said. "Himself. And he's got a man I don't recognize, city clothes, not a ranch hand, carrying papers." Martha and Aldridge looked at each other. "Lawyer," Aldridge said. "Can he do anything tonight?" Martha asked. "Legally, no, but legally has never been the primary constraint on Crowder's behavior." Aldridge closed his satchel and held it against his chest. "He's going to try to create a situation that justifies taking the strongbox as disputed property, pending a legal hearing. Get it out of your hands and into Briggs's custody while he controls the process." "What stops that?" "Witnesses," Aldridge said. "As many as possible, and me being here in an official capacity." Martha turned to the assembled families. "I need everyone outside, front of the barn, visible standing, not aggressive, just present." She looked at each face. "You're not doing anything wrong. You're witnesses to a legal proceeding involving your own land claims. That's your right." She paused. "Nobody draws a weapon unless I say so." "And if Crowder's men draw first," Cork, the older brother, "then God help them," Caleb said quietly from the doorway, "because everyone in this town will have seen it." The barn emptied outward in an organized way that impressed Martha. Not panic, not bravado. Just people who had decided which side of something they were on and were willing to stand there visibly. They arranged themselves in front of the stable in the warm night air, the Cork brothers to the left, the widow Tansy near the center, with a straightness of spine that suggested she'd been waiting for this specific moment for longer than she'd admitted to anyone, Hector flanking her right. Martha came out last, the strongbox under her arm, and Ash beside her on a loose lead. Crowder's party came up the street at a walk which was its own kind of statement, controlled, deliberate, the performance of a man who believed he was still running this. Crowder himself looked different from the mountain encounter. He'd changed clothes, which struck Martha as a detail that meant something. He'd had time to go home, to prepare, to dress for an occasion he'd decided to frame as formal. His city lawyer rode beside him, a narrow man with a document case across his saddle. Behind them, Tate and the ranch hands. And at the back, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, Sheriff Briggs. Crowder pulled up 10 feet from the gathered crowd and looked at it with the expression of a man recalculating. He'd expected fewer people. Martha watched him understand that and watched him decide it didn't change his approach. That told her something important. He'd committed to this course and couldn't adjust without showing weakness. And Crowder, she'd come to understand, would do nearly anything to avoid showing weakness. "Mrs. Wren," he said. His voice was controlled, even, the social voice, the voice for audiences. "I've come to resolve this situation peacefully." "It was peaceful before you arrived," Martha said. A ripple moved through the assembled families, something between tension and satisfaction. Crowder's lawyer nudged his horse forward slightly. "I have here a territorial court order filed this afternoon in the county seat, requiring all materials removed from Crowder land holdings to be surrendered to Sheriff Briggs, pending a judicial review of provenance claims." Martha looked at Aldridge. Aldridge stepped forward. Thomas Aldridge Territorial Land Commission, Helena office. He said it calmly, but the effect on Crowder's lawyer was immediate and visible, a slight straightening, a reassessment. May I see the order? A pause. The lawyer looked at Crowder. Crowder nodded fractionally. The lawyer rode forward and handed the document to Aldridge, who examined it in the lamplight from the stable door with the methodical attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The silence stretched. An insect hit the lamp glass and fell away. Ash shifted her weight slightly, and Martha steadied her with a hand. This order, Aldridge said finally. References materials removed from Crowder land holdings. The materials in Mrs. Wren's possession were found on public territory lands, specifically the Split Rock Creek area of the Bitterroot Range, which has no recorded private ownership claim. He looked up. This order doesn't apply. The brand registration on that horse, the lawyer started, is registered to Samuel Wren, Martha said. My father, who is dead, which makes the mare my inherited property. She looked at Crowder directly. You told your men my father was dead. Yesterday on this street, I heard them say it. A dead man's brand, they said. So which is it? Mr. Crowder is my father dead, in which case his property and his horse come to me, or is he missing? In which case the territorial authorities need to investigate what happened to him. She let that sit for a moment. Pick one. Something moved behind Crowder's eyes, fast, gone quickly, but visible. Briggs cleared his throat. Now there's no need to... Sheriff Briggs, Aldridge said, turning to face him with the full weight of official authority in his voice. I am placing you on notice that an investigation into land fraud, public records falsification, and related crimes is being conducted by the Territorial Land Commission. Any action you take tonight that interferes with the preservation of evidence or the safety of witnesses will be included in that investigation's report. He paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Briggs went the color of old flour. I understand, he said, barely above a whisper. Good, Aldridge said. Crowder's jaw had tightened to the point where it was doing visible work. He looked at his lawyer, who gave the microscopic shake of a head that meant not tonight, not this way. He looked at Tate, who was reading the crowd with the professional attention of a man counting odds. He looked at Briggs, who was currently staring at his own saddle horn with the focus of someone trying to become invisible. He looked at Martha, and what Martha saw in that look was not fury she could have handled. What she saw was something colder and more dangerous, the look of a man who was retreating tactically, not surrendering. The look of a man who was already thinking about tomorrow. This isn't finished, he said. No, Martha said. It's not, but it's different from what it was yesterday. She held his gaze. You know what's in this box. You know what Owen Marsh is prepared to say. You know what these families are prepared to testify. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 30 years ago, you could make problems disappear because nobody was watching and everyone was isolated. You can't isolate us anymore. Crowder turned his horse. He rode back down the street without another word, his lawyer and his ranch hands following Tate, last glancing back once with an expression that was professional assessment rather than personal threat. Briggs remained for a moment alone, looking at Martha with the expression of a man standing at a fork in a road he'd been avoiding for years. Mrs. Wren, he said quietly, for what it's worth. I knew something wasn't right back when I first took this job. I told myself it was too late to change anything. He stopped. I was wrong about that. Yes, Martha said. You were. I'll send the telegraph to the marshal's office myself, he said. Tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Not forgiveness, she didn't have the energy for forgiveness tonight, and Briggs didn't deserve the comfort of it yet. But acknowledgement. The recognition that a man could turn even late, and that turning mattered even imperfectly. Briggs rode away. The crowd in front of Hector's stable exhaled collectively, a long release of held breath that sounded almost like wind. The storm broke at midnight. Rain came down hard on Caldwell Flats on the dry Montana summer that had been building toward this for weeks, The kind of rain that the earth took in immediately and gratefully, the ground too thirsty to let any of it stand. Martha sat inside Hector's kitchen with the strongbox on the table, and Aldridge across from her finishing his documentation by lamplight, while the rain hit the roof with steady percussion. Caleb brought her coffee without being asked, set it down beside her without comment, went back to the window where he'd been keeping watch. She drank it without looking up from the ledger page she was reading for the 4th time. "You should sleep," he said. "You should stop telling me what I should do," she said. Fair enough. Owen Marsh had fallen asleep in the corner of the kitchen on Hector's spare chair, his chin on his chest. The sleep of a man who had put down a very heavy thing and whose body had responded immediately to the reduction in weight. Martha looked at him occasionally. She was still working out what she felt about Owen Marsh. Gratitude and anger braided together, which was an uncomfortable combination, but an honest one. Hector came in from the stable. "Ash is settled," he said. "She was restless with the storm, but she's calm now. Dell's with her." "Thank you," Martha said. She meant it for more than the horse, but didn't know how to say that, and Hector was the kind of man who didn't require it to be said. "My wife's name is on those deeds," Hector said, sitting down heavily at the end of the table. "The original name before the correction. It was her family's land. Her grandfather homesteaded it." He was quiet for a moment. "She never believed we'd lost it legally. All these years she said there was something wrong with the paperwork. I told her to let it go." "You were trying to protect her," Martha said. "I was scared," Hector said. "There's a difference, and I stopped letting myself pretend otherwise about 3 hours ago." Martha looked at him. She was right. She was right, he agreed. "I'm going to have to figure out how to tell her that." "Tell her plainly," Martha said. "She'll appreciate the plain version more than any other." Hector almost smiled. "You sound like her." The rain kept on. At 2 in the morning, something happened that Martha had not anticipated and should have. The back door of the kitchen opened. Not forced opened with a key, which meant someone who had access to Hector's property. Martha was on her feet with her hand on the Colt before the door had fully swung. Caleb was up from the window in the same moment, rifle raised. The woman in the doorway was perhaps 65, with silver hair plastered flat by the rain, and an expression of such compressed urgency that she was visibly vibrating with it. She was dressed in a good coat, mud splashed at the hem, and she held up both hands immediately at the sight of the weapons. I'm Frances Crowder," she said. "Silas's wife." Nobody moved for a moment. "Why are you here?" Martha asked. Her voice was flat and careful. "Because my husband is going to burn your cabin down tonight," Frances Crowder said. "He sent Tate 20 minutes ago with 2 men and a lantern. I heard him give the order, and I saddled my horse in the dark, and I rode here in the rain." She looked at Martha with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted in the way of a woman who has been tired for a very long time. "I am so tired," she said, and it clearly meant something larger than tonight. Martha lowered the Colt. "Caleb," she said. He was already moving, grabbing his coat and rifle. "I know. Take Cork's younger brother. He knows the South Road." "I'll go around east," Caleb said. "Faster, and they won't expect it." He looked at Martha once, a look that held several things at once, none of which they had time to discuss, and then he was gone out the front door into the rain. Martha turned to Frances Crowder. The woman was still standing in the doorway, hands lowered now, rain dripping from her coat onto Hector's floor. She looked at the strongbox on the table, and at the sleeping Owen Marsh, and at Aldridge, who had stood up and was watching her with the careful attention of a lawyer assessing a new element. "Come in," Martha said. "Close the door." Frances came in, stood near the table. She looked at the strongbox with an expression that Martha read not as territorial, but as recognizing the look of someone who knows what something is. "You knew," Martha said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question with an answer she could already see. "Not at first," Frances said. "Not about your father specifically. Not until years after." She sat down in the chair that Hector pulled out for her slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose body was reporting weather. When I understood what Silas had done, what he'd built, and on what I had children. I had a life. I told myself it was too late, that saying something would only destroy more people than it saved. You could have said something at any point in 40 years, Martha said. Yes, Frances said, I could have. She didn't add anything to that. She didn't try to defend it. That restraint, that plain acknowledgement told Martha something about her. What made tonight different? Martha asked. Frances looked at her directly. He was going to burn down an old woman's house, she said. To silence her. To buy himself 6 more months or a year, or whatever he thought he could get. Something crossed her face. My husband has done terrible things. I've looked away from terrible things. But I was not going to sit in that house and watch him burn yours down and do nothing. She paused. Everyone has a line. You should have found yours earlier, Martha said. Yes, Frances said again, simply. I should have. Aldridge cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Crowder, are you willing to give a statement? Frances looked at him. Is that what this requires? It would help considerably. She straightened in the chair. The rain hammered on. Owen Marsh stirred in his corner, lifted his head, saw Frances Crowder, and went very still. Then I'll give a statement, Frances said. Caleb came back before dawn. He came in wet and mud-streaked, and carrying the particular controlled expression of a man who'd been in a physical confrontation and was in the process of deciding how much to report and how. The cabin's standing, he said. Martha, who had not let herself fully breathe since he left, let herself fully breathe. Tate. In Hector's storm cellar. Cork's boy has him. Caleb set his rifle by the door. The other 2 ran when they realized they were outnumbered. I know which direction they went. They'll go to Crowder, Martha said. Yes. Then Crowder knows Tate didn't finish the job, and that his wife is gone. She looked at the window where the first gray edge of pre-dawn was visible at the bottom of the glass. He has nothing left to do that doesn't make things worse for him. Cornered men do the things that make things worse, Caleb said. I know. She looked at him, at the exhaustion on his face and the steadiness underneath it, the combination of a man who had been through hard nights before and had learned to function through them rather than past them. Are you all right? He looked slightly surprised by the question. Fine, he said. Caleb. He met her eyes. I'm fine, Martha. Ask me that again after we sleep. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged, however obliquely, that there might be an after, that this thing they were in the middle of had a far side, and that they might reach it together. Martha looked away first. The territorial marshal arrived the following afternoon. Not the 3 days they'd estimated. Briggs's telegraph, sent in the rain at midnight as promised, had reached an office closer than Helena, and the marshal stationed there had taken it seriously enough to ride through the night. His name was Calloway, a compact, sun-browned man of perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone who had seen enough human behavior to be difficult to shock and easy to persuade when the evidence was presented clearly. He arrived to find a signed statement from Thomas Aldridge of the Territorial Land Commission. A signed statement from Owen Marsh detailing 11 years of irregular accounting and 1 direct conversation in which Silas Crowder had described Samuel Wren's death as a necessary decision. Signed statements from Frances Crowder, the widow, Tansy Hector Pruitt, the Cork brothers, and 4 other affected families. Tate in the storm cellar, who, when presented with the weight of evidence against his employer and the specific charge of arson attempted the previous night, made the calculation that loyalty to Crowder was now a considerably worse investment than cooperation with the marshal's office. And the strong box, all its contents intact, Samuel Wren's letter on top. Calloway read through everything in Hector's kitchen with the methodical patience of a man who understood that this moment would be referenced for years and needed to be gotten right. He asked questions. He asked them twice in different ways, which Martha recognized as the technique of someone checking consistency rather than expressing doubt. He took notes in a small leather book that he kept tucked in his coat pocket. When he was finished, he closed the strong box carefully. Silas Crowder will be taken into custody today, he said. I'll need a deputy to accompany. Briggs will go with you, Martha said. Calloway looked at her. He's cooperating, she said. He has been since last night. Use him. She held the marshal's gaze. He knows Crowder's property and his habits. And frankly, having the local sheriff present when the arrest is made sends a message to this town about how things are going to work going forward. Calloway considered this. That's a practical assessment. I'm a practical woman, Martha said. He almost smiled. So I'm told. Crowder was arrested at his ranch house at 3 p.m. with Calloway and Briggs and 2 deputies and the full weight of documented evidence that made his lawyer's presence entirely performative. Martha heard about it from Del Pruitt, who'd ridden out to watch from the ridge and came back with the specific, breathless energy of a 16-year-old who has witnessed history and knows it. He didn't fight, Del said. He just walked out, like he knew. He knew, Martha said. He's known this was possible since 1843. He's just spent 40 years making sure the right moment never came. Did it feel like you thought it would? Del asked. When you heard? Martha thought about that honestly. No, she said. It feels quieter than I expected. Del processed this. Is that bad? No, she said. I think quiet is what it was always supposed to feel like. That evening, with the marshal's paperwork filed, and Crowder in custody in the county seat, and the families dispersing to their various homes with copies of Aldridge's documentation, and the first real certainty most of them had felt in years, Martha went back to her cabin. Caleb rode with her. He didn't ask permission. She didn't revoke it. The cabin smelled of summer grass and old wood, and the particular dusty warmth of a structure that had been closed up during a hot day. She opened the windows. The evening air came through carrying the after-smell of last night's rain, the clean, particular scent of Montana earth after water, the kind of smell that felt like a beginning. She lit the lamp on the table, sat down, put nothing between herself and the silence for a long moment. Caleb came in, looked around once, and sat in the chair across from her without speaking. He'd learned that when to speak and when to simply be present. It was, Martha thought, a rarer skill than most people understood. My father's grave, she said finally. Calloway says they'll send a survey team to the campsite. Official recovery. She stopped. I want to be there when they bring him home. I know, Caleb said. You will be. She looked at her hands on the table. Work-worn age spotted the hands of a woman who had done everything required of her for 62 years with these hands, and would keep doing it. Her father's hands had looked like this. She remembered them clearly. He said in the letter that he didn't know how to tell me he loved me, she said. Called it a father's failing. She was quiet for a moment. He was wrong about that. He told me every time he showed me something how to read land, how to treat a horse, how to leave marks so things can be traced back. Every lesson was him saying it. Caleb didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was low. Some people only know how to love through what they teach. Yes, Martha said. I think that's right. Another silence. Outside, Ash moved in the lean-to, the familiar sound of the old mare settling for the night, the particular piece of an animal that had been fed and was not afraid. What happens now? Caleb asked. Martha looked up. Aldridge says the land commission process will take months, maybe longer. Some families will get compensation. Some will get the land back. Some will get neither because the law is a slow and imperfect mechanism. She folded her hands on the table. Owen Marsh will testify. It won't be comfortable for him. And for you, I'll testify about what I found and where I found it. She paused. And I'll bury my father properly. And I'll tend to my land and my horse. She met his eyes across the table. Same as I've always done, just with the weight of it different. He was looking at her in that way he had the way that saw all of it and didn't require it to be other than what it was. My spread's not far. he said carefully. 4 miles past Harmon Ridge. I know where Harmon Ridge is, she said. I'm just saying. He stopped. Tried again. 4 miles isn't far. Martha looked at him for a long, steady moment. 62 years old, she thought. A dead husband, a lost father, a life spent managing on her own and getting good at it. 4 miles wasn't far. And Caleb Rusk, whatever else he was a man who'd ridden through a night to bring witnesses to a mountain, who'd kept watch without being asked, who'd known when to speak and when to be quiet. Those were not small things. No, she said finally. It isn't. He nodded once. The conversation they weren't quite having settled between them, like something agreed upon, provisional and real, at the same time neither of them in a hurry to define it more precisely than the moment required. Martha stood up and went to the window. The summer night was soft and full of sound insects, a distant owl ash moving in the lean-to. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. Somewhere up there in the Bitterroots, her father's camp sat in the summer dark, waiting for the official party that would come to bring him home. 40 years he'd been up there, waiting in the patient way of things that cannot wait actively but endure anyway. She pressed one hand flat against the window frame. Pa, she said quietly, we're bringing you home. Outside, the Montana night breathed around the cabin wide and indifferent and beautiful, the way it had breathed through every hard thing and every good thing that had ever happened on this land. The stars didn't care about justice or grief or 40 years of silence. But Martha Wren did, and she had made the stars witness to it anyway. The territorial court convened in Caldwell Flats 6 weeks after Crowder's arrest, and the town that had laughed at Martha Wren in the auction yard showed up in numbers that nobody had predicted. They came because word had traveled, the way word always travels in small places, not through official announcement, but through the particular human current of people telling people, neighbor to neighbor, ranch to ranch, the story passing through kitchens and feed stores and Sunday morning gatherings, until nearly everyone in 3 counties had some version of it. A blind horse, a $1 bid, a strongbox buried in the mountains for 40 years, a woman who wouldn't stop. The courthouse was the largest building in Caldwell Flats, which was not saying much. It was a plain structure with hard wooden benches and windows that admitted more heat than light in July. Every bench was full. People stood along the walls. 2 men Martha didn't recognize were taking notes, which Aldridge told her meant the territorial newspapers had sent correspondence. Martha sat at the front with Aldridge to her left, and Caleb 2 rows behind her, close enough that she could hear him shift his weight when things got tense, which was a more comforting awareness than she would have expected or admitted to anyone. Owen Marsh took the stand first. He looked smaller in the courtroom than he had in Hector's barn. The formality of the setting had a way of compressing people, of making visible the gap between what they'd done and what they were now being asked to account for. He sat very straight. He answered every question in a clear, deliberate voice that did not waver, which Martha knew cost him considerably more than it appeared to. Crowder's lawyer, a different man from the one on the mountain, someone brought in from Helena with more experience and better clothes, tried to establish that Marsh had altered records himself, that the irregularities in the books were Marsh's doing, rather than Crowder's instruction. Marsh absorbed this without reacting. "Mr. Marsh," the lawyer said in the particular tone of someone who believes condescension is a legal strategy. "You kept these records for 11 years. You signed your name to them. Is it not possible that the discrepancies you're describing are the result of your own errors?" "It's possible," Marsh said. "It's not true." "You have no documentation of direct instruction from Mr. Crowder." "I have his words," Marsh said. "He told me directly in his office on the second floor of his ranch house in the winter of 1880 that Samuel Wren had been dealt with and that the matter was permanently closed. Those are the words he used. Dealt with. I understood what they meant. I have understood for 11 years. He paused. "I should have said something 11 years ago. I didn't. I'm saying it now." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Crowder's lawyer moved on. Frances Crowder testified after the noon recess. She came in wearing black, which Martha noticed, and which the assembled crowd noticed, and which seemed to carry a weight of intention. She was mourning something but not her husband's legal jeopardy. Something older. Something she'd been mourning privately for a long time. She answered questions in the short, precise way of a woman who had edited herself for decades and had recently decided to stop. When Crowder's lawyer suggested that her testimony was motivated by marital discord, she looked at him with an expression so completely devoid of patience that he actually stopped mid-sentence. "My testimony is motivated by the fact that a man was killed," she said, "and his daughter spent 40 years not knowing why her father never came home. And I knew, and I said nothing." She paused. "I am here because it is the right thing to do. I understand that's a foreign concept in this proceeding, but I'd ask you to make your peace with it." Someone in the gallery laughed. It was not unkind. Laughter. It was the laughter of recognition of people hearing something expressed plainly that they'd all been thinking. Crowder's lawyer did not ask Frances Crowder another question. Martha was called to the stand in the mid-afternoon when the July heat had built inside the courthouse to the point where several of the older attendees were fanning themselves with their hats, and the air smelled of summer sweat and wood, and the particular dry-throat feeling of a room full of people holding their breath. She walked to the stand, the way she walked everywhere, without performance, without hurry. The long-practiced economy of a woman who had learned that dignity was mostly about not wasting motion on things that didn't matter. She stated her name, her age, her relationship to Samuel Wren. Aldridge, conducting examination for the commission's interest, walked her through the auction. The brand, the map, the climb, the strongbox. She answered each question in the same plain, direct manner she used for everything, and the courtroom stayed very quiet, the kind of quiet that a story earns when it's being told without embellishment. When she described reading her father's letter at Split Rock Creek, the words, "I did not run the closing declaration of love." He hadn't known how to speak directly. She heard movement in the gallery behind her. Not disturbance, the movement of people adjusting to accommodate emotion they hadn't expected to feel in a courtroom on a hot July afternoon. She did not let herself feel it fully. Not here, not yet. She'd learned to store it, to hold these things carefully, until she was somewhere private enough to put them down properly. Crowder's lawyer cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He questioned the chain of custody of the documents. He questioned whether the alterations she'd identified on the land deeds could have been made by anyone, not specifically Crowder. He questioned the reliability of 40-year-old evidence. He was professional and persistent, and Martha answered every question with the same patient, unhurried certainty. And the longer the examination continued, the clearer it became that he was not making progress. Not because his questions were poor, but because the answers were simply not available to him. The truth was the truth, and it had been the truth for 40 years, and all the legal architecture in the world couldn't make it otherwise. Finally, he asked, "Mrs. Wren, isn't it possible that your certainty about these events is driven more by grief than by evidence, that a daughter's desire to explain her father's disappearance has led you to conclusions that the evidence doesn't fully support?" Martha looked at him. The courtroom went very still. "No," she said. He waited for more. There was no more. "Could you elaborate?" "I could," Martha said. "But the documents in that strongbox elaborate more clearly than I can. I'd suggest you read them again." She held his gaze. "My grief is real, and it belongs to me. The evidence belongs to this court. Keep them separate, and you'll find they point in exactly the same direction." The lawyer sat down. Aldridge from his table did not permit himself to smile, but his pen made a small, satisfied sound against his notepad that Martha heard clearly. Crowder took the stand the following morning. Nobody had been certain he would. His lawyer had clearly advised against it. Martha could read that in the brief, tight exchange visible between them as Crowder made his decision. But Crowder was at his core a man who had spent 50 years believing that his own presence and authority could change rooms. He had walked into difficult situations and made them favorable through sheer force of confidence for so long that he apparently believed even now that he could do it again. He was 72 years old, and he sat in the witness chair with his spine straight and his hands folded, and the manner of a man presenting himself for admiration. The courtroom looked at him the way you look at something that was once powerful and has since been reduced, not without acknowledgement of what it had been, but without the fear that used to accompany that acknowledgement. The examining attorney asked him about the land acquisitions. He answered smoothly with the practiced fluency of someone who had told these particular lies so many times they'd acquired the texture of memory. The survey discrepancies were clerical errors. The witness statements he'd paid for were freely given. The men who'd left their land had done so voluntarily, finding it unworkable. "Mr. Crowder," the attorney said, "Owen Marsh has testified that you told him directly that Samuel Wren was, quote, dealt with. Do you deny saying that?" "I have no recollection of that conversation," Crowder said. "Francis Crowder has testified." "My wife," Crowder said carefully, "has been under considerable strain." "Your wife," the attorney said equally carefully, "has provided a detailed account of a specific conversation you had with her in the spring of 1844, in which you told her that a problem with a local rancher had been resolved. Do you deny that conversation occurred?" A pause. The first pause in Crowder's testimony. Small, but visible. "I may have said something to that effect," he said. "The word resolved covers a great deal of ground. Does it cover murder, Mr. Crowder?" The room erupted. The judge called for order, and the room gave it back reluctantly, like something being relinquished under protest. Martha sat completely still at the plaintiff's table. She felt Caleb's attention on her back, from 2 rows behind, steady, and present the awareness of it, like a hand between her shoulder blades, without the weight. Crowder's composure had cracked. Not shattered. He was too controlled for that, but cracked the way ice cracks the damage visible in lines that hadn't been there before. "I did not murder Samuel Wren," he said. "Did you order it?" "I did not." "Tate Harmon," the attorney said, and something shifted in the room. At that name, the shift of people who hadn't known this was coming. "Your former foreman, currently in custody, has provided a sworn statement. He states that in March of 1843, you instructed him to ensure that Samuel Wren did not complete his journey to the Territorial Marshal's office. He states that he carried out that instruction. He states that you paid him $100 upon his return and told him the matter was settled." The attorney set the document on the table in front of Crowder. "That is a sworn statement, Mr. Crowder. Would you like to tell this court that Tate Harmon is also under considerable strain?" Silas Crowder looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. The courtroom held its breath. When he looked up, something had gone out of his face, not guilt exactly, because Martha did not believe he was capable of the particular kind of guilt that resembles remorse. But the performance had ended. The character he'd been playing for 5 decades had walked off stage, and what was left was just an old man in an expensive coat who had made a choice in the spring of 1843 and spent the rest of his life managing its consequences. "I want to speak with my lawyer," he said. The judge called a recess. Martha walked out of the courthouse into the July heat and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. Caleb came out behind her. He stood beside her without speaking, and she was grateful for that, for the silence that didn't require anything from her, that simply held space while she felt what she was feeling, which was something she still didn't have a clean name for. Not triumph. Not relief. Something more complicated. The specific emotion of a person who has spent 40 years carrying something heavy and has just set it down, and is now reckoning with the fact that the weight has left an impression in the shape of her. "He's going to deal," Caleb said quietly after a while. "I know. His lawyer will negotiate reduced charges in exchange for a full confession, saves the court a lengthy trial, puts everything on record." He paused. "It won't be everything you wanted." "Nothing is ever everything you wanted," Martha said. "That's not the same as nothing." He was quiet. "My father's name will be cleared," she said. "The families will have documented recourse. The Land Commission will have grounds to act on the deeds." She looked out at the street at Caldwell Flats going about its Tuesday business around the edges of this historic day, people moving past the courthouse with the slightly heightened awareness of those who know something significant is happening nearby. Samuel Wren will be on the record as a man who tried to do the right thing and was killed for it. That matters. That's not nothing. No. Caleb agreed. It's not nothing. She turned and looked at him. At his face in the full July light, sun-weathered and direct, the face of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and had demonstrated both of those qualities consistently over the past 6 weeks, in ways that mattered more than any declaration could have. "What did you lose to Crowder?" she asked. She'd been patient about it, but patience had its end. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "My father's grazing rights. It was before I was born. He got pushed off the water trail that ran through the eastern pasture. Couldn't sustain the cattle without it. Sold out for almost nothing and moved the family north." He paused. He never talked about it directly, but I watched it make him smaller year by year. Watched what it does to a man when the land he worked is taken, and nobody says it was wrong. He stopped again. "Your father's brand in that ledger. Page 7. Wren grazing allotment reassigned. 3 lines below that my father's name. Same page." Martha absorbed this. "You knew when I showed you the ledger," she said. "I saw our names on the same page," he said. Yes. She understood something then that she hadn't fully understood before about why he'd come to her yard that morning, why he'd followed her up the mountain, why he'd ridden through the night to bring the ranchers. Not only because it was right, though it was right, but because he had his own 40 years in it, his own inheritance of loss, his own reason to see this particular fire all the way to its end. "Your father's name is in that ledger," she said. "I know. Aldridge can use it. I know that too. Caleb." She waited until he looked at her directly. "I'm glad you were there." He held her gaze. "So am I." Crowder entered a formal plea agreement 2 days later. Full confession to land fraud, falsification of public records, and conspiracy in the death of Samuel Wren. The conspiracy charge was the one that had required negotiation. His lawyer had pushed hard for manslaughter, for diminished circumstances, for the argument that 1843 was a different time with different standards. Calloway and Aldridge had held the line. What emerged was not perfect. Martha had not expected perfect, but it was real, and it was documented, and it was public. Silas Crowder would serve his remaining years under house arrest at his ranch. His legal empire dismantled his land holdings, placed in receivership pending the Commission's review of every acquisition made since 1840. He was too old and too broken by the proceedings for the marshal to argue successfully for prison. And Martha, when Aldridge presented this reality to her, sat with it for a long moment, and then said simply, "He'll live to see everything he built come apart." That's a longer punishment than a cell. Aldridge had no response to that. The Land Commission review that followed over the next 4 months was slow, imperfect, and uneven, all the things Martha had expected it to be. 3 families received portions of their original land back outright. 7 more received financial settlements that were less than what they'd lost, but more than nothing. The Cork brothers got their pasture, the specific piece of land their grandfather had fenced by hand, the piece with the spring-fed creek, and the old cottonwood their family had planted to mark the property line. The older Cork brother stood in the commission office when the deed was returned to him and cried without making a sound, tears running down his face, in the silent, compressed way of a man who hadn't let himself do this in a long time. The widow Tansey received a settlement and an official letter of acknowledgement from the Territorial Land Commission, stating that her family's property claim had been valid and had been fraudulently transferred. She read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, and put it in the same trunk where she'd kept her husband's death certificate. 40 years too late, she said to Martha when she came to show her. Yes, Martha said, but the letter still says the right thing. It does. Tansey looked at her. You did a good thing, Martha Wren. Martha thought about the auction yard, the laughter, the $1, the brand on Ash's shoulder that everyone else had walked past without seeing. I just followed what was already there, she said. They brought Samuel Wren home on a Thursday in late August. Marshal Calloway's survey team had located the remains exactly where the letter had indicated above Split Rock Creek in the soft earth near the collapsed fence post. The recovery had been handled with the specific professional care of men who understood that what they were doing was not only procedural. Martha was there. She had ridden up with Caleb and Hector Pruitt and Dell and the widow Tansey who had insisted on coming, and whose insistence Martha hadn't argued with. The morning was cool, the late summer mountain air, carrying the first intimation of the fall that was still weeks away, a sharpness at the edge of the warmth, the way seasons always gave notice before they changed. Ash made the climb without difficulty. Martha had half expected in the private, illogical way that people expect things they haven't allowed themselves to think about directly, that the mare would struggle on the way back, that this return trip, the one she'd been preparing for without knowing it, would be harder for a blind old horse than the first ascent had been. But Ash moved with the same steady, trust-based rhythm as always, reading Martha's signals, following the voice and the pressure and the direction, unbothered by what she couldn't see. She never needed to see everything Martha thought. She just needed to trust what she could feel. The recovery itself was quiet, handled by the marshal's men with efficiency and respect, and Martha stood nearby with her hat in her hands and her eyes open because she had decided she was not going to look away from any part of this. She had spent 40 years not knowing. She was not going to spend another moment of her life choosing not to know something she was able to know. They found the pocket watch first. Calloway brought it to her personally. The glass was long broken. The hand stopped at 7:14, morning or evening. She would never know, but the case was engraved on the back with her father's initials and a date, the year of her birth. He'd had the watch engraved when she was born. She hadn't known that. Nobody had told her. She held it in both hands and felt it, the specific weight of an object that had been her father's, that his hands had touched, that had been with him in his last hours in this place. "He carried you with him," Caleb said quietly from beside her. She couldn't speak for a moment, so she just nodded. The belt buckle came next, and then the remains themselves, which the survey team handled with the full dignity of official procedure, and which Martha watched with the steadiness she had prepared for, the steadiness that was not the absence of grief, but grief organized around a purpose. When everything was gathered, Calloway came to her. "We'll transport him to Caldwell Flats," he said, "for a proper burial whenever you're ready." "I'm ready," Martha said immediately. Calloway nodded. He started to turn away, and then stopped. "Mrs. Wren, for what it's worth." He paused, choosing words with the care of a man who usually dealt in facts and found himself in different territory. "In 30 years of this work, I have not often seen evidence assembled as carefully as your father assembled that box. He knew what he was doing. He knew it had to last. He looked at her. He made it easy to do right by him. That's a rare thing." Martha looked at the strongbox, which Calloway's deputy was carrying down the trail. Its work done now, its contents submitted to courts and commissions, its long underground tenure finally at an end. "He always said, 'Leave clear marks,'" she said, "so the truth can be traced back." Samuel Wren was buried in the Caldwell Flats Cemetery on the last Saturday of August, and the number of people who attended was not something Martha had anticipated or prepared for. They came from all 3 counties. Families who'd lost land and families who hadn't. People who'd known Samuel Wren in 1843 and were old now, appearing like figures from a photograph given unexpected life. People who'd never known him at all, but had heard the story, and came because the story meant something to them, because it was their story too, in the way that all stories about ordinary people refusing to be erased are everyone's story. The minister spoke. He was a decent man who had known Martha most of his life and chose his words with the respect of someone who understood he was not the main event. Then he asked if anyone wanted to speak. Martha had not prepared anything. She stood up anyway. She faced the crowd, the largest gathering she had ever stood in front of, and for a moment she felt the full weight of it. The faces turned toward her, the summer heat pressing down the smell of cut grass from the fresh grave. "My father was not a remarkable man in the ways the world usually calls remarkable," she said. "He didn't have money or connections or power. He had a piece of land and a herd of horses and a particular stubbornness about what was true and what wasn't. She paused. He found evidence that a powerful man had stolen from ordinary people. He gathered that evidence carefully and completely. He tried to carry it to the people who were supposed to act on it. He was killed for that. She looked at the assembled crowd steadily. He was 43 years old. I was 21. I have spent 41 years with the space he left. She felt her voice do something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she let it. He was right about everything that mattered, and the world finally said so. 40 years late, imperfectly, with the usual slowness and compromise of justice in the real world. She stopped. But it said so, and Samuel Wren's name is on the record now, attached to the truth he died for. That's what I came here to say. She sat down. The silence that followed was the kind a crowd creates when it has been moved past its own expectations of what the day would be. Caleb beside her put his hand over hers on the bench. Just that. Just briefly. Just enough. She turned her hand over and held his. The marker was placed 2 weeks later. Aldridge had arranged for it through the Territorial Commission. Not a grand monument. Nothing that would have embarrassed the plain man. It commemorated but solid marble, well cut, meant to last. Martha had approved the inscription herself, sitting at her kitchen table with the commission's proposed text in front of her and a pencil in her hand, crossing out the language she didn't want and keeping what she did. What it said in the end was simple. Samuel Wren, 1800–1843. He chose truth over fear. His daughter brought him home. The day the marker was set, Martha rode out to the cemetery alone. She stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. She read it once, read it again. Then she said, "That's right, that's exactly right." She rode home satisfied. October came to Montana Territory with its particular gold and cold clarity. The aspens turning the morning sharp, the mountains wearing the first dusting of the winter that was coming. Martha's cabin had been repaired. Caleb and Hector had come out in September with timber and tools, and 2 days of work fixing the roof section that had been failing for 3 years, and the doorframe that had swelled in the summer heat, and the lean-to where Ash lived, that had always been one bad winter away from collapse. Martha had cooked for them and not argued about the work, which was its own form of changed relationship with both men. Ash was thriving. This was the word that came to Martha's mind on a regular basis and continued to surprise her every time thriving. The old blind mare, who'd been scheduled for a bullet at a summer auction, was moving through the world with a confidence and vitality that defied every practical assessment of her condition. She'd put on weight. Her coat had improved to a quiet silver that caught light well. The children in Caldwell Flats, who had initially been brought by their parents to see the famous horse out of historical curiosity, had begun coming on their own initiative, bringing her apples and dried grass, and simply spending time in her company. Drawn. Martha thought to the particular quality of calm that Ash carried, the peace of a creature that had been through everything and come out the other side still interested in the morning. Del Pruitt came most often. He was 17 now, taller since the summer, with the new seriousness of a young man who'd been present at something significant and had let it change him. He helped Martha with the heavy work that her knees complained about in cold weather, and in exchange she taught him what her father had taught her: how to read land, how to treat a horse, how to leave clear marks so the truth could always be traced. He was a good student, the best kind one who listened more than he spoke. One morning in October, Del was brushing Ash while Martha mended harness nearby, and he asked without looking up from his work, "Mrs. Wren, do you think Mr. Rusk is going to keep coming around?" Martha did not look up from her mending either. "That seems likely," she said. Del processed this. "Is that all right with you?" "Del," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Mind your own." He grinned at the horse's flank and said nothing more, and Martha allowed herself one small private moment of something warm and uncomplicated before returning to her work. Caleb came that evening. He came the way he'd been coming since September, not every evening, but enough evenings that his horse knew the way, and Ash knew his horse's footfall and turned her head toward the sound before Martha heard it herself. He came with practical things, information about the commission review, news from the county seat about the Crowder case's ongoing proceedings, once a letter from Aldridge that had been delivered to the Harmon Ridge Post before Martha's. He was very good at having reasons. Martha was very good at letting him have them. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the letter from Aldridge, which contained the news that the Cork brothers had registered their deed, that Tansy's settlement had been finalized, that Owen Marsh had testified at the last commission hearing and done it well, that the case was moving toward its conclusion with the grinding, imperfect momentum of all legal things. "It's almost over," Caleb said. "The legal part," Martha said. "The rest of it," she thought about that. About what the rest of it looked like, the day-to-day continuation of a life that had been reorganized around an absence for 40 years and was now reorganizing itself around something else. Presence, maybe. The presence of her father's story fully known and properly placed. The presence of people who had chosen to stand beside her. The presence of an old blind horse who had, in the blind and unbothered way of animals that survive everything, simply continued to be alive and interested in the world. "The rest of it's fine," she said, and meant it. Caleb looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the October dark outside the windows. "Martha," he said. "Caleb," she said. He reached across the table and set his hand down, flat palm up. An offering. Nothing demanded, nothing assumed. Just here if you want it. She looked at his hand. At the work-worn, sun-darkened, honest hand of a man who had ridden through a night and kept a watch and known when to speak and when to be quiet. She put her hand in his, and the Montana night held them both in the easy, indifferent way that night holds everything, the good and the broken, and the things slowly becoming whole, while Ash moved in the lean-to, and the aspens rattled their gold leaves in the dark, and Samuel Wren lay in honored ground 3 miles away, with his name finally permanently correctly on the record. Martha Wren had paid $1 for a dying blind horse and gotten back her father, her history, her name, and something she hadn't known she was still capable of wanting. Some things the world called worthless were only waiting for someone brave enough to see what they were really worth. And Martha Wren, stubborn, steady, 62 years old and not finished yet, had been exactly that person at exactly that moment in exactly that dusty summer auction yard. Not by accident, by everything her father had ever taught her,